Some stories don't need gunfights or showdowns to matter. They need something quieter, something true. This is a tale from the old frontier, the kind your grandmother might have told you on a porch swing, back when evenings were slow and hearts were honest. It's about a young widow who lost everything but her dignity, and a drifter who'd been running so long he forgot what he was running from. There's no violence here, no bloodshed, just two souls finding their way through a world that wasn't always kind. I wrote this for folks like you and me, people who've lived long enough to know that the hardest battles aren't fought with fists. They're fought with silence, with patience, with the courage to be decent when decency costs you something. So settle in, pour yourself some coffee. Let's go back to Montana. Autumn of 1883. The bell above the door hadn't stopped ringing when Henry Polk looked up from his ledger. Clara Weston stood at the threshold, wicker basket hanging from the crook of her arm, empty. She'd walked 2 miles from the edge of town for this, 2 miles in shoes worn thin at the soles. The store smelled of pickle brine and tobacco. Sunlight cut through the dusty window, catching the flour dust floating in the air. 2 women stood by the fabric bolts, Mrs. Harmon and her sister-in-law, whose name Clara could never remember. They stopped talking the moment she walked in. Clara kept her eyes forward, lifted her chin, walked to the counter. "Mr. Polk." He didn't answer right away, just ran his finger down a column of numbers, lips moving silently. Then he looked up, face blank as a closed door. "Miss Weston," not Mrs., not ma'am, Miss, like she'd never been married at all. Clara set her basket on the counter. "I need flour, 5 pounds, sugar, 2 pounds, and salt pork, if you have it." Polk sucked his teeth, turned slowly toward the shelves behind him, shelves stacked full, barrels brimming, tins lined up neat as soldiers. He made a show of looking, squinted, shook his head. "Flour spoken for. There's a whole barrel right there. Spoken for." He turned back, folded his arms. "Sugar too. And the pork, well, I reckon I'm saving that for regular customers." The whisper came from the fabric bolts. Clara heard it clear as a church bell. That auction girl still dares to show her face. Heat climbed up Clara's neck. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the coins she'd been saving for 3 weeks, set them on the counter, 1 by 1, 2 quarters, 3 dimes, a nickel. They clinked against the wood, small and bright. "I have money, Mr. Polk, same as anybody." He looked at the coins, looked at her. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not guilt, not shame. Something colder. He picked up the coins and slid them back across the counter. "All spoken for." "You know how it is." Clara stared at the money, her money, earned scrubbing floors and mending clothes and selling eggs from the 3 hens she kept alive through sheer stubbornness. She could argue, could raise her voice, make a scene, demand what was rightfully hers. But she'd done that before. In those first weeks after the auction, it only made things worse, gave them something else to whisper about. So she picked up the coins, dropped them back in her pocket, picked up her empty basket. The door felt heavier on the way out. Clay Sands had just finished tying Ranger to the post when the woman walked out of the general store. He noticed the basket first, empty, then the way she walked back straight, shoulders tight, chin up like she was daring the world to say something. But her hands were shaking. She stopped in the middle of the street, didn't look back, just stood there, dust swirling around her faded blue dress, the basket swinging against her hip. Clay had seen that posture before, on men who'd lost everything at the card table but wouldn't give the others the satisfaction of seeing them break, on soldiers walking away from graves they'd just finished digging, pride holding a person together when everything else had fallen apart. The 2 women from inside the store appeared in the window, watching. One of them smiled, the woman in the street young, he realized now, maybe mid-20s. Hair the color of autumn wheat pulled back in a practical knot took a breath. Her shoulders shook once, just once. Then she started walking, away from the store, away from the main street, toward the edge of town where the houses got smaller and the roads turned to dirt. Clay watched her go. The empty basket swung with each step, catching the afternoon light. He'd planned to buy supplies and move on. That was the way of it. 3 years of moving on. Don't stop. Don't get involved. Don't let anyone's trouble become yours. But his feet didn't move toward the store. They stayed planted right where they were, watching that straight back and those shaking hands disappear down the dusty road. If this story speaks to your heart, I'd be mighty grateful to know where you're listening from today. The old folks always said a shared story is twice as warm, so drop a word and let's sit a spell together. Clay untied Ranger from the post. He didn't think about it, didn't plan it. His hands just moved, loosening the knot, gathering the reins, leading the horse down the street in the same direction the woman had gone. The buckboard sat where he'd left it, wheels dusty, bed empty. He climbed up, clicked his tongue. Ranger knew the signal. They rolled forward, slow and easy, past the blacksmith and the feed store and the sad little church with its crooked steeple. He spotted her a quarter-mile out, still walking, still carrying that empty basket like it weighed 100 pounds. The road narrowed here. Grass grew tall on both sides, yellow and dry from the autumn sun. Clay pulled up alongside her, keeping pace with her stride. She didn't look at him. "Ma'am." Her jaw tightened. He could see the muscle jump beneath her skin. "Ma'am, hold up a minute." She stopped, turned. Her eyes were dry, no tears, not even close, but something in them made his chest hurt. Wariness. The kind that came from being burned too many times. "What do you want?" Clay kept his hands on the reins, visible, non-threatening. "Nothing." "Then why are you following me?" "Good question." He didn't have a good answer. Just the truth. "I saw what happened in there with Polk." Her chin came up. "That ain't none of your concern." "No, it ain't." He shifted on the seat. "But I got a wagon. And there's a store in Willow Springs, 2 hours west. They don't know you there." She stared at him, searching his face for the catch, the trick, the price she'd have to pay later. "I don't need charity." "Ain't charity. You got money. They got goods. I got wheels." He shrugged. "Just makes sense. I figure." The wind picked up, rustling the dry grass. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals. Clara's fingers tightened on the basket handle, knuckles going white. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." Clay looked at her. Really looked. At the mended dress and the worn shoes and the pride holding her spine straight when everything else was trying to bend it. "Don't need to know you," he said. "I know Polk. That's enough." She didn't answer. The hawk screamed somewhere above them. Then she took a step toward the wagon. The wagon wheels creaked against the packed dirt. Ranger's hooves struck a steady rhythm, clop, 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 the only sound for the first mile. Clara sat on the far edge of the seat, as far from him as she could get without falling off. Her basket rested between them like a fence. She kept her eyes forward, fixed on the road ahead, on the mountains rising blue and distant against the pale autumn sky. Clay didn't push, didn't try to fill the silence with small talk. He'd spent 3 years learning the value of quiet. Some folks talked because they were scared of what might come up if they stopped. He'd never been one of those. The road curved through open grassland. Switchgrass rose waist-high on both sides, turned golden by weeks of dry weather. Wild asters dotted the edges, small purple flowers that would be gone in another week when the first frost came. A red-tailed hawk drifted overhead, riding the wind without a single flap of its wings. Clara's hands loosened on the basket handle, just a little. Clay noticed, but didn't look. The silence stretched on, not uncomfortable now, just there, like the grass and the sky and the steady clop of Ranger's hooves. She spoke first. "What's your name?" Clay kept his eyes on the road. "Clay Sands." "I'm Clara." "I know." He adjusted the reins, shifted his weight. "Heard it in the store." She turned her head, just enough to look at him from the corner of her eye. "You were in there. Just walked in when you were walking out. Then you heard what they said. It wasn't a question. Clay nodded anyway. I heard. She looked away again. Her jaw worked, like she was chewing on words she couldn't quite spit out. The basket sat between them, wicker handles casting small shadows on the seat. They passed a stand of cottonwoods, leaves rattling in the breeze. A creek ran somewhere nearby. Clay could hear it before he saw it, the soft rush of water over stones. We should stop, he said. Let Ranger drink. He guided the wagon off the road, down a gentle slope to where the creek widened into a pool. Clear water ran over white stones, shallow enough to see the bottom. Ranger lowered his head and drank, lips rippling the surface. Clay climbed down, stretched his back. 3 days in the saddle before he'd hit Copper Creek, and his spine hadn't forgiven him yet. Clara stayed on the wagon. You can get down, he said. Stretch your legs some. She hesitated. Then she set the basket aside and climbed down, moving carefully, one hand on the wagon for balance. Her shoes, he could see now how thin the soles were, how the leather had cracked at the seams. She walked to the creek's edge, knelt on a flat stone, cupped her hands in the water and brought it to her face. The water ran down her cheeks, dripped from her chin. She stayed there, eyes closed, hands still cupped like she was praying. Clay looked away, gave her the moment. He walked upstream a few paces, pulled his canteen from the saddlebag, knelt to fill it. The silver ring on his little finger caught the light. He stopped, looked at it, turned it once with his thumb. Sarah had given it to him the day she got married. So you don't forget me, she'd said, laughing, like it was a joke, like he could ever forget. He stopped turning it, shoved his hand in his pocket. When he looked up, Clara was watching him. Where are you from? She asked. Texas. The word came out rough. He cleared his throat. Long time ago. What brought you up this way? Nothing special, just riding. She didn't push, didn't ask the follow-up questions most folks asked. Why are you alone? Where's your family? What are you running from? She just accepted the answer and let it lie there, small and incomplete, on the stones between them. Clay found himself asking before he could stop himself. You live alone? Yes. She stood, wiped her hands on her dress. 2 years now. Husband, gone. She didn't elaborate, didn't need to. I'm sorry. Don't be. It was a long time coming. She looked at the creek, at the water running clear over the white stones. The dying was slow, the debt was fast. Clay nodded. He knew about debt. Not the money kind, the other kind. The kind you carried in your chest like a stone you couldn't put down. We should go, she said. Still an hour to Willow Springs, I reckon. Yeah. Neither of them moved. Ranger lifted his head from the water, shook his mane. Droplets scattered in the sunlight. Catching the afternoon glare, Clara looked at Clay, really looked. For the first time since she'd climbed into the wagon, her eyes were gray. He realized, gray like the sky before rain. Why are you really doing this? She asked. The truth. Clay met her gaze, held it. The ring pressed against his thigh through the fabric of his pocket. Sarah's ring. Sarah's voice in his memory, bright and young and trusting. I'm fine, Clay. Go on. I'll be fine. He opened his mouth to answer, but what came out wasn't what he'd planned to say. Willow Springs appeared around a bend in the road, a single main street. A water tower. A handful of buildings huddled together like they were keeping each other company against the empty prairie. Smaller than Copper Creek, quieter, no church steeple, no bank, just a general store with a faded sign and a livery stable with its doors hanging open. A dog slept in a patch of sun near the water trough. It lifted its head when the wagon rolled past, then put it back down. Clay pulled up in front of the store. The wheels groaned as they settled. Dust rose and fell around them. You go on in, he said. I'll wait out here with Ranger. Clara looked at the storefront. The windows were clean, glass catching the afternoon light. An orange cat slept on the porch railing, fur bright against the weathered wood. A chalkboard by the door listed prices in neat handwriting flour. Sugar, coffee, salt pork, all available, all ordinary. Her heart kicked against her ribs. What if they don't know you here? Clay wrapped the reins around the brake lever, settled back in his seat. You're just a woman buying supplies. That's all there is to it. She climbed down from the wagon. Her legs felt strange beneath her, unsteady from sitting so long. The basket hung from her arm, empty and waiting. She smoothed her dress with her free hand, straightened her collar, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The door had a brass handle, tarnished green at the edges. She gripped it. The metal was warm from the afternoon sun. She pushed. A bell chimed overhead, small, bright, cheerful. The sound made her flinch. The store smelled different from Polk's. No pickle brine, no stale tobacco. This place smelled of coffee beans and fresh bread and something floral, like dried lavender hung somewhere out of sight. Sunlight poured through the windows, falling in golden rectangles across the wooden floor. A woman stood behind the counter, silver blonde hair pinned up in a practical bun, wire spectacles perched on the end of her nose. She looked up from the ledger she'd been writing in, smiled. Good afternoon. What can I help you with today, ma'am? Ma'am. Clara's throat tightened. She swallowed, forced herself to speak. Flour, 5 pounds, please. Of course. The woman, Mrs. Olson, according to the hand-painted sign above the counter, turned to the shelves behind her, pulled down a paper sack, began scooping flour from the barrel, movements quick and sure. Clara watched her hands, capable hands, working hands. No hesitation, no sideways glances, no whispered conversations with invisible companions waiting in the shadows. Anything else for you? Sugar, 2 pounds, and salt pork, if you have it. I surely do. Mrs. Olson set the flour on the counter with a soft thump, reached for the sugar tin. The weather's been mighty fine this week, hasn't it? I do enjoy autumn. The light's different somehow. Softer. Clara stared at her. The woman was making small talk. Ordinary small talk. The kind folks made with customers they didn't despise. Yes, Clara managed. Softer. That's a good way to put it. Mrs. Olson wrapped the salt pork in brown paper, tied it with twine, her fingers moving in practiced loops, added it to the growing pile on the counter. Will that be all? Clara's eyes drifted to the coffee. Beans sat in a glass jar behind the counter, dark and glossy. The smell rose even through the sealed lid, rich, earthy, warm. She hadn't had coffee in months. Couldn't justify the expense when there was barely enough for bread and lamp oil. But she had money today, real money, earned and saved and hers. Coffee, she heard herself say. 1/2 pound, if you please. Good choice. This batch is fresh roasted. Just came in Tuesday. Mrs. Olson measured the beans into a small cloth sack, drew the string tight with a neat bow, set it on the counter with the rest. The total came to 63 cents. Clara counted out the coins with steady hands, steadier than they'd been all day, placed them on the counter one by one. 2 quarters, a dime, 3 pennies. Mrs. Olson swept them into the cash drawer without counting twice, without scrutinizing, without sliding them back across the wood like they were something dirty. Thank you kindly. She began wrapping everything together in brown paper, folding the corners crisp and neat. You new to the area? I don't reckon I've seen you in here before. I'm from Copper Creek, just passing through. Oh, that's a fair piece to travel. Nice enough town. Though, I have a cousin there runs the feed store. I believe... Clara didn't know who ran the feed store in Copper Creek. She'd never been inside, never had reason to be, never been welcome anywhere she didn't absolutely have to go. Here you are. Dad, as Mrs. Olson handed her the packages, stacked and tied with twine for easy carrying. Come back anytime you're in the area, ma'am. We're open 6 days a week, closed Sundays for the Lord's Day. Ma'am? Again, twice in one conversation, 3 times if she counted the first. Clara's hands shook as she took the packages. Not much, just a tremor, barely visible, but she felt it down to her bones, felt the warmth of the paper, the weight of the flour, the reality of what had just happened settling over her like a blanket she'd forgotten existed. She'd walked into a store, asked for goods, paid her money, been served. Like anyone else, like a normal person, like a woman who'd never stood on an auction block while strangers bid on her future. "Thank you," she said. Her voice came out thick, strange. Mrs. Olson's smile stayed warm. "You're welcome, dear. Safe travels home." Clara walked to the door, pushed it open. The bell chimed again, that small, bright, cheerful sound, and this time she didn't flinch. The sun hit her face. The air smelled of dust and horse and autumn grass. The orange cat on the porch lifted its head, blinked at her with sleepy eyes, went back to its nap. Clay sat in the wagon, hat pulled low against the glare, watching the livery stable across the street. He turned when he heard her footsteps on the wooden porch. She stopped at the top of the stairs, packages clutched against her chest, basket forgotten on the wagon seat where she'd left it. Her eyes burned. Her chest felt tight and loose at the same time, like something had cracked open inside her, and she didn't know yet whether to be afraid of what might come spilling out. When was the last time someone had called her ma'am? She couldn't remember. Clay didn't say anything, just watched her standing there on that stranger's porch, holding brown paper packages like they were made of something precious. She opened her mouth to speak and realized she was crying. The ride back took longer than the ride out. Neither of them mentioned it. Clara held the packages in her lap, brown paper warm against her palms. The tears had stopped before they'd even left Willow Springs. She'd wiped her face with the back of her hand, climbed into the wagon without a word, and Clay had driven on like nothing had happened. She was grateful for that. Grateful he hadn't asked, hadn't tried to comfort her, hadn't made it into something it wasn't. The sun hung low by the time they reached Copper Creek. They skirted the main street, took the back road that wound through the pastures to the edge of town. Clara's house sat there alone, small and weathered, with a sagging porch and a chicken coop out back. Clay pulled the wagon up to the fence, climbed down, lifted the packages from Clara's lap before she could protest. "I'll carry these in for you." And she led him up the path, past the 3 hens pecking in the dirt, past the woodpile that needed splitting, past the rain barrel with its rusted rim. The door stuck when she pushed it. She had to lean her shoulder into the wood, and it groaned open. Inside, the house was small but clean. One room served as kitchen and sitting area, a narrow doorway leading to what must be a bedroom beyond. A cast iron stove squatted in the corner, cold and dark. A table stood by the window plain oak, scarred from years of use with 2 chairs tucked beneath it. 2 chairs. Clay noticed that. Noticed, too, the curtains, faded but pressed neat, and the rag rug on the floor, colors still bright where it had been kept out of the sun. He set the packages on the table, turned his hat in his hands. "Well, I reckon I should get going." Clara stood by the stove, hand resting on its cold surface. She didn't look at him. "You've come a long way today," she said. "Have you eaten anything?" "I'm fine." "Says just." "That ain't what I asked." Clay's stomach answered for him, a low growl that echoed in the quiet room. He pressed his hand against it, heat rising to his face. Clara's mouth twitched, almost a smile, the first he'd seen from her all day. "Sit down," she said. "I'll cook something. You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She pulled a cast iron pan from the shelf beneath the stove, metal scraping against wood. "Sit." He sat. The stove took a while to heat. Clara built the fire with practiced hands, kindling first, then small sticks, then a split log from the pile by the door. The flames caught, crackled, spread their warmth into the room. Heat began to push back the autumn chill that had settled in the corners. Clay watched from the table, watched her unwrap the salt pork, slice it thin with a knife that needed sharpening, watched her measure flour into a cracked bowl, add water from the pitcher, knead the dough with quick movements that spoke of years of practice. She moved like someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Alone, always alone. The pan heated on the stove. She laid the pork slices in one by one, and they sizzled and popped, filling the room with the smell of cooking meat. His stomach growled again, louder this time. "There's a pump out back," Clara said, not turning around. "If you want to wash up before we eat." He went. The pump handle was stiff from disuse, needed priming with water from the bucket beside it. But eventually it gave cold. clear water that tasted of iron and earth. He splashed his face, scrubbed his hands until the road dust ran off in gray rivulets, dried them on his bandana. When he came back in, the table had been set. 2 tin plates, 2 tin cups, a small crock of butter, where had that come from, and bread still steaming from the pan, golden brown at the edges. The kerosene lamp sat in the center of the table, wick trimmed and burning steady, casting a circle of yellow light against the gathering dusk. Outside the window, the last of the daylight was bleeding out of the sky. Clara set the pork on a serving dish, carried it to the table, sat down across from him. "Do you mind if I say grace?" Clay shook his head. She bowed her head, closed her eyes. Her voice came soft, barely above a whisper. "Lord, thank you for this food. Thank you for bringing it to this table. Amen." "Amen," Clay heard himself say. The word felt strange in his mouth, unfamiliar, like a language he'd forgotten he once knew. They ate in silence. The pork was good crispy at the edges where the fat had rendered, tender in the middle. The bread was better warm and dense, perfect for soaking up the grease left on the plate. Clay couldn't remember the last time he'd had fresh bread. Months, maybe longer. Clara ate slowly, watching him from across the table. The lamplight caught the gray of her eyes, turned them almost silver in the soft glow. "You cook mighty fine," he said. "My mother taught me. Before she passed, mine too." The words came out before he could stop them. He stared at his plate. "Long time ago now." Clara nodded. Didn't push. Didn't fill the space with questions he didn't want to answer. They finished eating. Clara poured coffee from a dented pot, the fresh beans from Mrs. Olson's store, ground with a hand mill that sat on the shelf by the window and brewed until the kitchen smelled like something close to heaven. "Do you have family?" Clara asked. "Anywhere." Clay wrapped his hands around the tin cup. The heat seeped into his palms, his fingers, his bones. "Had a sister." His voice came out rough, scraped raw. "Sarah, she got married, few years back. I thought," he stopped, started again. "I figured she'd be fine." "What happened?" The lamp flickered. A moth had found its way inside somehow, was circling the flame in desperate spirals, wings beating against the glass. "She wasn't fine." Clay stared at the coffee, at the dark surface reflecting his own face back at him. "And I wasn't there." Clara's hand moved across the table, stopped an inch from his, close enough to feel the warmth of her skin without touching. "I'm sorry," she said. The moth brushed too close to the flame. Its wings caught, and it fell. Clay left at first light. Clara stood on the porch, arms crossed against the morning chill, watching him climb into the wagon. He'd slept in the barn, insisted on it, wouldn't hear any argument, and now he sat with the reins loose in his hands, hat pulled low, looking at her from beneath the brim. "There's a ranch up north," he said. "Miller's place. I heard they might be hiring hands for the season." She nodded, didn't trust her voice to hold steady. "I'll come back." He shifted on the seat. "Check on you. In a few days. I reckon." "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't." Ranger stamped his hoof against the hard-packed dirt, shook his mane, ready to move. "Thank you," Clara said. "For yesterday, for all of it." Clay touched the brim of his hat. The wagon rolled forward, wheels creaking in the quiet morning air, and she watched until it disappeared around the bend in the road where the cottonwoods grew thick. Then she went back inside and stared at the 2 tin plates still sitting on the table from last night's supper. 2 days passed. On the 3rd morning since Clay had gone, Clara fell back into the rhythm that had kept her alive these past 2 years. There was comfort in routine. The familiar demands of survival left no room for thinking about things that couldn't be changed. She fed the chickens at dawn, scattering feed from the tin pail while they pecked and squabbled around her feet, drew water from the well, washed her spare dress in the wooden tub behind the house, and hung it on the line to catch the autumn breeze. The packages from Willow Springs sat on the shelf above the stove: flour, sugar, salt pork, coffee. She'd baked bread that first morning alone, kneaded the dough until her arms ached and her mind went quiet. And the smell had filled the house for hours afterward. Now she walked to the well with the empty bucket swinging from her hand. The rope hung from its iron pulley, frayed at the edges where the weather had worn it thin. Clara grabbed the handle and began to lower the bucket into the darkness below. The pulley squeaked, needed oiling. Had needed it for months now, and the rope ran rough and familiar through her palms. Voices drifted over the fence. She froze. The bucket hung suspended halfway down the shaft, rope biting into her fingers. 2 women stood on the road beyond her property line. She couldn't see their faces from here, but she recognized the voices. Mrs. Harmon, that sharp. Carrying tone was impossible to mistake, and someone else, her sister-in-law. Maybe. The one from the store. They weren't looking at her house. Were making a deliberate show of not looking. In fact, heads turned toward each other like they were deep in private conversation, but they were talking loud enough for sound to carry clear across the yard. Saw the wagon myself, Mrs. Harmon was saying. Parked right there by her fence. Bold as anything. All day long and clear through the night. No, you don't mean it. Which I'm telling you true. Mabel Harper saw it too. When she went out to check on her sick cow that evening, said she could see the lamp burning in that little house past midnight. Past midnight, mind you. Well, the other woman's voice dripped with something sour and satisfied. I suppose she found herself another way to pay for things, same as always with her kind. Henry Polk says the very same. Says she came into his store bold as brass that morning, trying to buy goods like a decent woman. And when he wouldn't sell to her, on account of her history and reputation, she went off and found some drifter to take up with instead. Some women got no shame at all. None whatsoever. Auction girl through and through. Just like folks always said. The bucket slipped. Clara grabbed for the rope, but her hands were shaking now, palms slick with sudden sweat, and the rough hemp burned through her grip as the bucket plunged down into the darkness. The splash echoed up the stone walls of the well, loud in the sudden silence. The women on the road went quiet, footsteps then, moving away down the packed dirt, fading into the distance. Clara stood there alone, hands stinging, rope hanging slack and useless in her grip. The sun beat down on her shoulders through the thin fabric of her dress. A fly buzzed lazy circles around her head, landed on her cheek just below her eye. She didn't brush it away. Martha Greeley came at sunset. Clara heard her before she saw her, the shuffle of worn shoes on the path, the familiar creak of the gate that needed its hinges oiled, the soft knock on the doorframe. She was sitting at the table when Martha pushed the door open, gray wool shawl wrapped tight around her thin shoulders, face creased deep with something that looked like worry. Child. Clara didn't rise from her chair. Come in, Mrs. Greeley. Martha crossed the room with slow, careful steps. Her knees weren't what they used to be. Nothing was. At her age. She pulled out the second chair, Clay's chair. Clara couldn't stop thinking of it that way now, and lowered herself into it with a grunt of relief. I have to tell you something, child. Something I figured you ought to hear from a friendly voice first. I already know. Martha's faded blue eyes went wide. You heard already. At the well this morning. Clara's voice came out flat, dead as winter grass. Mrs. Harmon and her sister-in-law. They made sure I could hear every word. Martha reached across the table, took Clara's hands in her own weathered grip. The old woman's fingers were rough from a lifetime of work, calloused and cracked at the knuckles, but warm, so warm against Clara's cold skin. Henry Polk has been telling everyone in town, Martha said, voice dropping low. He's been saying you. She stopped, swallowed hard. He's saying you seduced that cowboy, that you traded yourself for those supplies he helped you get. Clara's hands twitched beneath Martha's grip. She didn't pull away. Not yet. He gave me a ride to Willow Springs. I bought the supplies myself, with my own money that I earned. There wasn't anything more to it than that. I know, child. Lord knows I believe you. Martha squeezed her hands tighter. But they don't care about what's true. They never have. Not when it comes to you. They just want something ugly to talk about. Someone to look down on so they can feel better about their own small lives. The lamp sat unlit on the table between them. The stove had gone cold hours ago. Gray ashes from 2 nights past still sat in the grate, dead and quiet. Clara pulled her hands free. What am I supposed to do? Her voice cracked down the middle like dry wood splitting. Stay locked inside these walls forever. Never speak to another living soul as long as I breathe. That man helped me when nobody else in this town would lift a finger. He didn't ask for anything in return. He didn't take anything from me. He just... She pressed her palm hard against her mouth to stop the words from spilling out. Martha sat in heavy silence. The shadows lengthened across the floor as the last light bled from the sky outside the window. I know, the old woman finally said, but knowing don't change anything. Not in this town. Not for someone like you. Clara stared at the empty chair across from her. At the place where Clay had sat just 2 nights ago, drinking coffee, telling her about his sister in that rough, broken voice. He'd said he would come back. Said he'd check on her in a few days. But what would he find waiting for him when he did? On the 3rd night since leaving Clara's porch, Clay made camp beside a shallow creek that cut through the prairie grass like a wound. The fire had burned down to embers. He sat with his back against a fallen cottonwood, watching the coals pulse orange and red in the darkness. Ranger stood nearby, tied to a low branch, head lowered in sleep. The moon hung fat and white above the empty land, casting long shadows across the grass that bent and swayed in the night wind. Miller's ranch lay another half-day's ride to the north. Another job, another paycheck, another reason to keep his legs moving and his mind empty. He should be there by now. Would have been, if he hadn't kept finding excuses to stop. A creek that needed crossing careful. A loose shoe on Ranger that needed checking twice. A sunset that needed watching from a ridge where nobody could see him watching it. Excuses. Every one of them. And he knew it. Clay reached into his pocket. His fingers found the ring without looking, knew the shape of it by touch now. Worn smooth from all the times he'd held it these past 3 years. He pulled it out into the firelight. Silver, tarnished at the edges where the metal had darkened with age. A simple band. Nothing fancy about it. Sarah had saved for 6 months to buy this ring, working at the milliner's shop in town, sewing ribbons onto hats for women who looked through her like she was made of glass. So you don't forget me, she'd said, pressing it into his palm the day she married Thomas Redfield, laughing while she said it, like it was a joke between them, like forgetting her was something that could ever happen. Clay turned the ring in his fingers. The firelight caught the engraving on the inside of the band, a single letter, scratched deep into the silver. Sss. He closed his eyes. The memory rose up like floodwater, no way to stop it, no way to push it back down. Sarah, standing on the porch of Redfield's house, 3 months after the wedding, October light falling across her face, her left eye swollen purple and green, not quite closed, but close. Her lips split at the corner where something had struck it hard. Her smile stretched too wide across her face, paper-thin and trembling at the edges. I'm fine, Clay. Really and truly... Thomas he had himself a bad day, that's all. He ain't usually like this. You know how men get sometimes. Clay had stood there on the bottom step, hat crushed in his hands, looking up at his baby sister's ruined face. He'd seen the truth. Seen it written plain as scripture in that swollen eye, in the way her hands shook when she reached for the porch railing, in how she flinched when a door slammed somewhere inside the house behind her. He'd seen it all, every bit of it, and he'd done nothing. I got a job lined up, he'd said. The words tasted like ash in his mouth even now. Ranch workout in Arizona territory, good pay. I'll be back in 6 months to check on you. 6 months. That was the promise he'd made her. 6 months and he'd come back, make sure she was getting on all right. He never came back. The letters found him instead. First from Sarah herself, short notes on cheap paper, cheerful on the surface, saying nothing real underneath. Then from the neighbor woman who lived down the road. Then from the county sheriff. Thomas Redfield had been found dead at the bottom of Culver's ravine. His horse fallen on top of him. Accident. The sheriff wrote, bad footing on a rainy night. These things happen. Sarah had been found 3 days after that. In bed, cold. an empty brown bottle of laudanum sitting on the nightstand beside her. The sheriff's letter had reached Clay in a mining camp outside Tucson. He'd read it by lamplight in a tent that stank of sweat and failure and red Arizona dust. Read it twice to make sure the words said what he thought they said. Then he'd walked outside into the desert night and fallen to his knees in the dirt. A storm had rolled through while he knelt there, flash floodwater pouring down the wash, churning the ground to thick red mud. He didn't move, didn't try to get up, just knelt there in the muck as the water rose around him, mud soaking through his trousers, spattering his chest, caking in his hair and beard. By morning he was covered in it, head to boots, red as blood and twice as heavy. He'd washed it off in a horse trough afterward, scrubbed at his skin until it was raw and bleeding in places. But some stains don't scrub clean. Some stains sink down into the bone. 3 years now. 3 years of running. 3 years of telling himself there was nothing he could have done different. 3 years of knowing that was the worst kind of lie a man could tell himself. The fire popped. A single spark floated up, drifted on the wind, and died. Clay opened his eyes, looked at the ring lying in his palm. Clara's face rose up in his mind. Gray eyes. Straight back. That empty wicker basket swinging against her hip as she walked away from Polk's store. She was alone, too. Surrounded by folks who wanted nothing more than to tear her down, grind her into the dirt, make her feel small and worthless so they could feel tall. And he'd left her there to face it by herself, just like he'd left Sarah. His hand closed around the ring. The metal edge bit into his palm, sharp enough to hurt. He could keep riding north, find Miller's ranch in the morning, collect his wages come winter, move on to the next job after that, the next town, the next excuse for something that looked like living. Or, the word hung in the cold night air like wood smoke. Ranger lifted his head, nickered soft and low, ears pricked toward the darkness beyond the dying fire. Clay pushed himself up from the ground. His knees ached from sitting too long on the cold earth. His back protested every movement. His whole body felt old and used up, worn down to something he barely recognized anymore. He walked to where Ranger stood waiting, pressed his forehead against the warm curve of the horse's neck, breathed in the smell of sweat and grass, and something that almost felt like home used to feel. 3 years, boy. His voice came out cracked, broken in the middle. 3 years I've been running from this. Ranger stamped his hoof against the hard ground, shook his mane in the moonlight. Clay looked east, toward Copper Creek, toward Clara, toward the thing he'd spent his whole life trying to outrun. The first pale edge of dawn was bleeding up over the horizon, and for the first time in 3 years, Clay Sands turned around. Clay rode into Copper Creek at dawn on the 5th day. The main street lay empty in the early light. Smoke rose thin and white from chimneys along the row of buildings. A stray dog trotted across the road, looked at him without interest, kept moving. The general store's windows caught the first rays of sun, turning the dusty glass into squares of pale gold. He tied Ranger to the hitching post, climbed the wooden steps to the porch, pushed open the door. The bell above the frame chimed bright and sharp. Henry Polk stood behind the counter, sorting through a stack of letters, sliding them into the wooden slots that lined the back wall. 2 customers moved among the shelves, a man Clay didn't recognize, examining a coil of rope, and Mrs. Harmon near the fabric bolts. Her back turned, fingers running across a length of blue calico. Polk looked up at the sound of the bell. His eyes narrowed when he saw who had walked in. Well, well. He set down the letters with a soft thump, leaned his elbows on the counter, smile spreading slow across his thin face. The drifter returns. Come back for more of the auction girl's hospitality. Have you? The man with the rope turned around. Mrs. Harmon's hands froze on the fabric. Clay walked to the counter, stopped 3 feet away, kept his hands loose at his sides where everyone could see them. I gave Clara Weston a ride to Willow Springs, he said. His voice came out level and quiet, filling the space without effort. She bought supplies there with her own money. I drove her home afterward. That's all that happened between us. Polk's smile widened, showing teeth. That ain't the way I heard tell of it. Then you heard wrong. Did I now? Polk straightened up behind the counter, crossed his arms over his chest. Funny how you spent the whole night at her place. Funny how your wagon sat parked by her fence clear till morning. Folks saw it with their own eyes. Folks have been talking plenty about what they saw. I slept in the barn. Sure you did. Mrs. Harmon had turned fully now, watching the exchange with wide eyes. The man by the rope had stopped pretending to shop. Clay looked at Polk, really looked at him, at the thin lips twisted in satisfaction, at the calculating eyes that held no warmth, at the smug pleasure of a man who'd found someone weaker to step on. You wouldn't sell to her, Clay said. She came in here with money in her hand. You had goods on your shelves. You turned her away empty. That's my right, my store, my choice who I do business with. Why? The single word hung in the air. Polk's smile flickered at the edges. What do you mean? Why? Why wouldn't you sell to her? What did Clara Weston ever do to you? Polk's jaw tightened. She's an auction girl. Everybody in this town knows what that means. What does it mean? It means... Polk stopped short. His eyes darted to Mrs. Harmon, to the man by the shelves, back to Clay. It means she couldn't pay her debts proper. Had to be sold off like livestock at the county auction. That kind of woman brings shame on her husband died. Clay's voice stayed level as a carpenter's line. Left her with nothing but bills she didn't make. The auction paid off his debts, not anything she owed. She worked honest for the widow woman who bought her contract. Worked hard until that woman passed on. Then she was free and clear. Silence spread through the store like spilled water. Mrs. Harmon's hand had dropped from the fabric bolt. Her face had gone pale beneath the rouge on her cheeks. She's been living alone for 2 years now, Clay continued, feeding herself by her own labor, keeping herself decent and respectable, not asking a single soul in this town for charity or favors, and you won't sell her 5 pounds of flour. The door at the back of the store creaked open. Pastor Thomas Whitfield stepped out from the storeroom, black felt hat in his weathered hands, the shape of a Bible visible in his coat pocket. His face was lined deep by decades of prairie sun and human sorrow. He moved past Clay without hurry, came to stand beside the counter where everyone could see him plain. The man speaks true, Henry. The pastor's voice was dry as old paper, but it carried clear to every corner. I've known Clara since before she was Clara Weston. Knew her when she was Clara Marsh, singing hymns in the church choir every Sunday morning. Knew her when she married James Weston. Against my counsel, he was a dreamer. That one. Always chasing after schemes that never came to nothing. He paused. Let the words settle. I spoke the words over his grave when he passed. I watched his widow stand there alone because not a single other soul in this town would come. Polk's mouth opened, closed, opened again. She's a good woman, Henry. Better than most folks I've met in all my years of ministry. The pastor's gaze was steady and unblinking. Better than some standing in this very room, I reckon. Something shifted in Mrs. Harmon's face. Her mother had been a widow once. Clara remembered Martha telling her, struggled alone for years after the fever took her father. The memory seemed to surface now behind her eyes, swimming up through the murk of years. She walked to the counter, set down a bolt of calico and a small sack. I'd like 3 yards of this fabric, she said. Her voice sounded strange, stripped of its usual edge. And a pound of sugar for Clara Weston. I'll take it out to her myself. Polk stared at her like she'd started speaking in tongues. Well, Mrs. Harmon's chin came up. Are you going to sell it to me or ain't you? Clara was scattering feed for the chickens when she heard the wagon. She straightened up from her work, shaded her eyes against the morning sun with her free hand. The buckboard came around the bend in the road, a familiar shape moving through the golden light. Clay. He pulled up to the fence, climbed down slow, like his bones were tired from riding, stood there with his hat in his hands, looking at her across the yard. You came back, she said. I did. The chickens pecked around her feet, oblivious to anything but the grain scattered on the ground. Clara set down the feed pail, wiped her hands on her apron, walked to the gate. Why? Clay looked at the dirt, at the sky, at everything except her face. "Something happened," he said. "In town. This morning." She listened as he told her. The store, Polk, the pastor stepping out from the back room, Mrs. Harmon buying fabric and sugar for her. The words came out rough and halting, like he wasn't used to stringing so many together at once. When he finished, Clara stood very still. "Mrs. Harmon, she said she'd bring it out herself. Today, I reckon." Clara pressed her palm flat against the fence post. The wood was warm from the sun, rough with age and weather, real, solid, something to hold on to. "I don't understand, Bob," she said. "She's been one of the worst ones. Why would she do something like that?" "I don't know." Clay shrugged, a small movement of his shoulders. "Folks are strange creatures. Sometimes they surprise you when you least expect it." A chicken wandered over and pecked at Clara's shoe. She nudged it away with her foot, gentle but firm. "Come inside," she said. "I'll put some coffee on." They sat at the table, the same chairs, the same tin cups. But something had shifted in the room. The air felt different somehow, lighter, easier to breathe. Clara poured the coffee, set a cup in front of him, sat down across the table. "You told them the truth," she said. "In the store, in front of everyone. Why did you do that?" Clay wrapped his hands around the cup, stared at the dark surface. "I had a sister." His voice scraped like a dull blade. "Sarah, I told you about her some—" Clara waited. Let the silence do its work. "She married a man named Thomas Redfield. I saw what he was from the start, saw the signs clear as day." He stopped, swallowed hard. "But she said she was fine, and I let myself believe her because believing was easier than staying." The coffee steamed between them. Outside the window, a rooster crowed somewhere in the distance. "She died," Clay said, 2 years after the wedding. I was out in Arizona when the letter caught up with me. I didn't even know she was gone until weeks after they put her in the ground." Clara's hands tightened around her own cup. "This morning, standing in that store, I kept seeing her face, kept thinking about what I should have done back then, what I didn't do." He looked up and met her eyes. "I couldn't stay quiet again. Not this time." Clara set down her cup, looked at the man sitting across from her, the weathered face, the work-roughened hands, the old grief carved deep into the lines around his eyes. "My husband was sick for near a year before he passed," she said. "Consumption. He spent every penny we had on doctors and tonics and miracle cures that didn't do a thing. When he finally went, I owed more money than I'd ever seen in my whole life." Clay listened, didn't interrupt. "The auction was the only way to clear the debt. That's all it was." She paused. "I survived it. We both survived our troubles. I reckon." They moved to the porch without deciding to, just stood up from the table, walked outside, sat down in the 2 wooden chairs that faced west toward the mountains. The afternoon had worn on while they talked. Now the sun was sinking low, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. "I found work," Clay said after a while. "Miller's Ranch, up north, half a day's ride from here." Clara's breath caught. "You're staying in these parts." "I am." He kept his eyes on the distant peaks. "If you don't mind me coming around now and then." She didn't answer right away, couldn't find words big enough for what she wanted to say. The sun touched the mountains. The light turned everything gold. Clara's hand moved across the space between their chairs, rested on Clay's hand for 1 heartbeat, 2. Then she started to pull away. Clay turned his hand over, palm up, open. She looked at that open palm, at the calluses and the scars and the silver ring glinting on his finger, at everything written there. She reached out again, and this time, she didn't let go. "If you're still here, sitting with this story, I want you to know something. It's all right to feel whatever you're feeling right now. Maybe something stirred in your chest while you listened. Something quiet, something you haven't touched in a long while. A memory of being overlooked when you needed to be seen. A moment when someone's unexpected kindness reached you in a way words couldn't explain. Or perhaps the weight of something you carry still. Something from years ago that never quite found its place to rest. Many of us have held things like that, silently, without telling a soul. We've stood in rooms full of people and felt invisible. We've reached out when we weren't sure we had enough left for ourselves. We've loved without saying so. And sometimes, we've walked away when we should have stayed. You don't need to make sense of any of it tonight. Some things aren't meant to be figured out or fixed. They're just meant to be held gently, the way you'd hold something fragile and dear. And that's enough. Thank you for staying. Thank you for listening all the way through.